This conversation with David Fribbins is very interesting. He's an engineer at heart, and so the conversation does turn a little more academic at times. As is often the case with these sorts of conversations, they can lack a little bit of emotion, and that can be hard to follow at times. But either way, have a listen and see what you think. Hello, welcome back to What a Future. We're back again, and we're joined today by David Fribbins. Now, David is currently the director of a company called Randee. They're a tax and soft money specialist, despite what it might initially sound like. But prior to that, he was the finance director of a construction company. And prior to that, he was a marketing director for a logistics company working with alcohol and beverages. That's quite a leap from marketing to finance there. How did that come about, David?
Yeah, hi Fraser, thanks for the intro. I think that the saying "jack of all trades, master of none" is probably a very good description of me and how I operate. I don't really have much of an appetite at becoming an expert in anything. Once I'm competent and able to do it, I generally find myself being quite bored and wanting a new challenge. So yeah, my career has sort of followed that trait. And unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately, it's probably a very good thing now, but in my early years, I'm not a very good employee. Partly because you generally take a role, you have your responsibilities, and they just remain the same, and you get better at them, and that doesn't really work with me. So yeah, that's how I've managed to get there. Is I find that I'm okay at something once I've learned how to do it. Okay, what's next? And yeah, I've landed on tax now, which is very big. So yes, I'd probably. My business partner is the specialist. While I've not gained the competency on the tax, that general knowledge becomes very useful for bridging the two. So yeah, that's roughly how I got here.
Excellent. No, that sounds fantastic. What I'm really curious about is, how did the job interview go for a finance director position where you go, so what was your previous position? Oh, yeah, I was marketing director.
Well, I was one of the owners of the company, so there wasn't really a job interview. No, it's very similar again. So my old business partner, who was the one in that company, he was a building surveyor and had been for 15, 16 years, was exceptionally good. He'd known me for years because I actually started out as a labourer for him when he was a sole trader. And he'd grown the company to the point of doing pretty big basement projects, but had no real sort of control over the finances or that. And obviously he knew I had a marketing background, but also knew that I could handle numbers. So it was just the timing was really nice. I'd left one job. He was looking to grow, and there was just a really nice synergy for that. Yeah, right time, right place.
That sounds fantastic. No, those kind of happy circumstance kind of jobs can work out really nicely, can't they? That you just everything just kind of aligns, and it just feels sort of good from there. That sounds brilliant. And so, what sort of got you going at Randee? What sort of started that going?
Yeah, so really it was about finding an opportunity. The construction company, because we were very specialist, we weren't just a building company. We dealt with quite complex waterproofing systems and designing them for complex buildings. So it was a very niche company. We qualified for a tax credit known as the R&D tax credit, and R&D Randee. That's the connection between the two. It's not just a euphemism. We qualified for the tax credit. We got a lot of money back, and as FD, I managed that process through, and worked out that actually there are lots and lots of companies that don't know about this or couldn't access it with quite that mixture of technical knowledge and tax knowledge. And so the accountant at the time that we were with, who's also a friend of mine, we said, look, there's an opportunity here. You handle the tax because it's a specialism that I don't have. I'll handle the technical. And really that's what led to this. So yeah, the transition was more of a, look, I've gained my competency in construction. I'm a little bit bored. The industry is brutal. It's not a great environment to work in if you're detail orientated generally. So it was one of those, look, it's time for me to really think about moving on. At the time, my business partner didn't want me to split responsibility. So we kind of said, okay, this is our plan, planned an exit, and we moved over and started the new business.
Fantastic. That sounds really, really exciting. So, yeah, interested then to bring this towards the world of work. That is obviously sort of why we're here. But with your sort of experience, obviously you've done a number of different things there. But in your opinion, what is the biggest problem affecting the world of work right now?
I think there are two main things that jump to mind with that. One of them is a practical issue, and it's not really the world of work. It's more of an economical, societal problem that comes out of it, but it is related to work, which is the increasing number of people that are at pensionable age leaving the workforce, who have had less children, whose children have then had less children again. So we end up with a workforce that becomes a very small percentage of a population, of which taxes fund pensions. So this is a major problem, but it's been a major problem for 60 years, getting worse, and no one's found a solution to it or decided what they're going to do about it. So that's one of the major issues, partly because I'm staring at the future, my next 30 years before I reach that age. And the only way I can view it working is if I get taxed at an enormous rate, which I don't really fancy, especially as someone who works in tax and trying to reduce that number.
Yes.
So that's one major problem. And this is really an issue for the Western world or the developed world. I know Japan probably have this problem more than anybody else on the planet right now.
Absolutely.
But we really aren't far away from it. In the next 10 years, I think it's 50% of our population are over the age of 60, which is terrifying. And obviously other countries that are major economies have the same problem coming.
Yes.
The other issue, which is probably the broader one, and probably a little bit more relevant for the actual workplace, I think that this is always true, but it's more true now than it's ever been, is that there's a shift in the balance of power. So go back to industrialization, all of the power sat with the employer. They to the point where they even built villages for their employees to live in. It was very much control. And pre that, it wasn't even employment. It was mostly through slavery, which is, like, again, even more control and more power sitting with the people that are at the top of the food chain, disseminating how they see fit. Industrialization, that follows the same suit, but starts paying people better. Fast forward 150 years, suddenly we're talking remote working, employee benefits, the discussion around culture at work being so important, psychology of human performance has come so far, and it's all leaning towards more individual empowerment than employer holding the power. And although that power has been slowly changing over decades, we're at an accelerated point now where employers are losing their power very, very, very quickly. And I don't, there's a pendulum that always seems to appear in most societies. You see it in politics. You have a right-wing party, you have a left-wing party, you have a right-wing party. The middle never really seems to be where people sit for a long time. And employment is probably in a similar position. The power has been slowly coming away from what we'll call the right, just to give it a side. That's not a political thing, it's just a side.
Yes.
It's very quickly swung, and it's now probably more on the left and gaining even more speed. So it will be interesting to see where that goes. But that's probably the biggest problem right now, is how do you manage that power shift, and how do you stop it becoming something that becomes abusive? Because obviously at the start, when we talk about slavery, pure abuse.
Yes.
Industrialization, still incredibly abusive by modern standards, but better. There's nothing to stop that pendulum swinging and becoming abusive the other way, where it turns into something else. I don't know what that looks like. It's just a natural progression theory.
Yes, interesting, and to bring back your first point there about the changing demographic of the workforce, it's almost upped the ante, hasn't it? To some degree, we need to maintain a certain amount of productivity within the environment. We need to get stuff done, otherwise nothing gets done. And so if you've got less people percentage-wise to do that thing, and yet the same amount of people consuming, then this kind of optimization of this working relationship becomes even more important as a result.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's another sort of subset to that issue as well, which crops up, which is to do with the introduction of technology. I can't remember who it is who gave the talk. I know it's a psychotherapist who's very divisive, but the talk was pretty impressive around IQ and the jobs that come with that level of IQ. Again, I'm not prescribing this as accurate, but it's an interesting thought process, at least. Engineering at the highest possible levels, we're thinking now carbon capture technologies, space travel. The IQ quotient for that job is incredibly high. Only the top 1%, 2%, 3% of humanity are able to actually fulfill that role. And you slowly bring that down to surgeons and high-level C-suite executives with enormous pressures and things going on. You bring it down, doctors, nurses, you bring it down again, and you sort of work your way down to labor. The roles that are stereotypically like retail or warehouse or construction, but the jobs where they're mostly repetitive tasks. So you don't need a lot of creativity. You don't need to problem solve. It's A, B, C. Go back, A, B, C, go back. And during industrialization, or even go before industrialization, even agriculture, that principle is the majority of work is that level, that intelligence quota. Technology changes those roles quite significantly. When you start bringing the first factories in, well, you don't need the workers to do the repetitive work anymore because machines are doing it, which means that the people that the factory now employ are developers who are in the higher quotients. And the IQ thing is an interesting one because it sounds very offensive, but it's actually just a plain fact. There are 8 billion people. We can all be measured by our intelligence on some kind of quantitative scoring. Half are going to be above the line, half are going to be below the line. There's no two ways about it. It's an average out of where you sit on a quantitative scale for intelligence. And that's not a value of the person as a human being, that there are so many other measurements that we can do for like emotional quotas and things.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to say here that IQ has been shown over and over again to be a very poor predictor of success. So there, I think it's important for the audience.
Exactly. It's not. This isn't about a measuring of a person as a person. This is about a job role and the requirements of a job role. Mm-hmm. But what we're finding now is a lot of these roles that would historically have been very repetitive and labor induced, so very physically demanding, don't get me wrong, very hard work, we're not talking about it being easy work, it's very hard work, but you now need quite complex problem solving skills, and you need to be able to interact and work with technology that is in and of itself an entire skill set, and suddenly most of these jobs that are in the lower half of the intelligence quota are no longer doable by people within that group. So the other challenge we have is not only are we seeing a much smaller proportion of people that are available to work because most are going into pensionable age, but actually the people in the bottom half of that scale aren't fit to do the jobs that they need to do because they physically can't do them. We don't need physical labor anymore. Well, we do, obviously we aren't away from this, but that's more of I think this is an interesting measure when you look at job satisfaction and how groups are now becoming more and more dissatisfied with jobs. The idea of being able to do your job, know you're good at it, and flourish becomes very difficult when that job might actually be beyond you. And that's a very difficult thing to even contemplate, but there is a reality to it that can't be ignored. So it's a subset of the thinking of one of the challenges that we're facing, but actually, I mean, the skill shortage is that's a very well known issue. Absolutely,
and I think it is a very interesting one, as you say. It's a sensitive debate and kind of rightfully so. But what is sort of interesting about it, I find, is that if you look at the way that history has gone, I think it's very easy to think that there's a sort of finite pool of resources that sort of go round, and this argument's often sort of brought up within sort of economics or politics or or work. But actually, the pool of resources, particularly with respect to the technological era that we're currently seeing, and where that might go with regards to increased web influence in our lives. Actually, we are either it's infinite, as economists sometimes like to argue. I have no dog in that fight. Or we are so far away from that pinnacle that actually at the moment it feels infinite anyway, even if it's going to tail off at some point. And so even though we've had this move towards sort of automation with regards to lots of farming and sort of industrial jobs, factory jobs, etc., what we've seen is we've got more job opportunities than we've ever had before, and all that's happened is it's massively increased our pool of available resources to share around. I think this is a really interesting perspective when it comes to, the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, I remember, quite clearly only sort of decade ago, there was a lot of argument over self-service tills at checkouts and whether this was, unfairly taking people's work and how but actually, there's still plenty of people working in supermarkets. And actually, there's just more supermarkets, and they sell more things. And I mean, the supermarket industry isn't perfect, but this is a trend that we tend to see. That the world of work kind of evolves to fit those people within it. And so I think it would be curious to see what happens in those positions. I mean, ultimately, we're now getting into kind of philosophy and sci-fi with regards, particularly to what happens in the world of AI. But that in itself is a very interesting one. But I'd like to loop back, I think, if you're happy to what you were saying about the relationship between employer and employee, and how that has changed, particularly with respect to the two other things that we've mentioned there. But this change, this move, this swing, what's the crack? What's the deal? Is this a positive thing?
It can be. I guess in all circumstances, it's the observer that decides whether it's positive or negative. For an employer, it's probably negative. For an employee, it's probably positive. And in 20 years' time, we'll probably have a more definitive notion of which one it was for each person. I think it's a difficult one. I think at the obviously human relationships are very complex, and employment is just another human relationship. Yes, there's a contract involved, but we're talking about human interaction. Unless we're talking about AI, but even that's built on human interaction and models. So we're still in the realm of humanity. At the absolute crux of it, an employment relationship is transactional. There's plenty more that goes on with that, but if you break it down and distill it to the very, very core purpose, it's transaction. Value in, value out. And I think it's exceptionally good that employees are now able to value themselves better than they have been before. I mean, obviously, different culture has very different views on this. If you look at American tipping culture, the fact that it's expected that somebody else is going to subsidize a person's wages rather than the employer to do a job that they're making very good money from is absurd, absolutely absurd, unless you're American, at which point it makes absolute sense because it's what you've always done.
Yes.
So there are certain things. I'm sure we have similar blind spots that we have in our things that are just like, this is ridiculous. Why is it done this way? But being able to say, no, this is what I'm worth. It's actually, I mean, the whole conversation there, or it wasn't really me ranting about IQ and quotient for job role. Again, that's very transactional language. But one of the things that sort of comes through is about value. And I think that it's important to be able to position yourself as an individual, understand your strengths and weaknesses, and say, this is the value I bring. And if you can quantify that, you're in a very powerful position. I think the difficulty is the expectation probably that young people entering the workforce can do that when realistically they can't. They've never really been in an environment where they can measure themselves properly. So you're probably going to have this huge skew of either I'm worth £100,000 a year starting out of university because I've got a degree, versus I'm a worm, I'm not worth anything, I've never worked for anyone. And you'll probably find people on both sides of that.
Yes.
It's not until someone actually sits down and starts a role and it's not even in that first role. Normally it's when you move in towards the management, you start to see the numbers behind the role. You start to go, oh, actually, we can attribute cost to this, profit to this. We can actually see value. And I think employment, and we've had this discussion previous, employment is a very, very bad way of getting people to self-evaluate and measure. Because although you have one-to-ones and you have these discussions, there's too many factors at play in those meetings, because you'll know this, staff can be unhappy very quickly, especially with a management that might be too direct for that person's personal approach to discussion.
Yes.
Which means that the conversations being had at a one-to-one level, there's a whole cultural dynamic going on of trying to ensure good performance out of a person that they might not be able to truly reflect on how they're actually doing and what their actual value is. And I'm not saying there's an answer to that that's simple. It's not. It's a very complex relationship. But in self-employment is very good for being able to establish your value, because you're entirely dependent on being able to bring value to extract it. And there's room there for abuse. There's room there for breaking down. It's not a foolproof. Yes, this is the holy grail of how we do this. But there's in that power swing, there's something moving towards employment that is skewing, and it feels like it's skewing towards the wrong end, or too far maybe. That the value proposition is changing, and that the employee is more valuable than they, or thinks they're more valuable than maybe they are. And this is very general terms. Like there will obviously be many different opinions on this. There'll be many different examples of this. It's just the current trend of all of the jobs that are opening up that aren't being filled, all of the perks and benefits coming to it. The value just seems to keep going up and up and up and up and up and up. But there has to be a ceiling there that, well, actually, if you're not providing this profit, you're not going to be able to sustain this. That's quite a roundabout way of answering that question. I don't even know if I have answered it directly.
I think ultimately the real thing there is this is really complex stuff, isn't it? It's trying to assign the sort of value in that way, and I think it's value doesn't necessarily mean a monetary figure. A different perspective is valuable. It's not so having that value, and that value can be is more than just your job role as well, isn't it? I mentioned perspective there. Even having people in an office environment who come from different backgrounds, different races, different they provide a different perspective on a given situation, which actually makes whatever you're doing far more balanced.
I think so. Money is a very good measure. It's not perfect, but it's a very good expression of power. Because I'm trying to think how to describe this without getting too ethereal. Money is a known quantity. We have a universal language for it. We all agree on it. And it's very, very good at measuring power that somebody has. The more money you have, the more power you have. There's a clear connection between those two things. But it's not the only measure of power. Influence, and normally again those two things come together. The more influence you have, the more money you have. They normally correlate, but they don't always correlate. You could be the richest man in the world. You walk into the wrong room, your money means nothing.
Yes.
And that's a power dynamic, which was the original point of that shift as it's moving. But you're absolutely right. Power can be measured in. I'm now saying what you're describing there, which isn't fair. But if we label that as power, and people have power, they can give it away, they can take it. Every interaction at a transactional level is a movement of power. There's a balance of it shifting. It's that being able to measure that, or being able to try to quantify it, is probably quite a useful way of doing it. Because you're absolutely right. There's a value that can be prescribed to almost every action and reaction, but it's not always monetary.
No, and it's not always immediately clear where it's come from either. I think that's the sort of other thing. So it's relatively easy to look at the balance sheet of a company and see how well it's performing. And it's relatively easy to take that balance and divide it by the number of employees and get a productivity per employee. It's very difficult to go and quantify that person's worth that person's worth that. And so there is an element of kind of, here's a job role, here's a thing, this is how much we pay for it, crack on. But within any job role, you have your superstars and you have your laggards. I forget who that was coined by, those two terms, but you have your your various people within the team that are providing more value than others. And where this is very obvious, I always pick on sales teams because ultimately it's very easy to quantify this in a sales team. How many sales did that person? How many sales did that person make? But actually, it does still end up more complicated because what if you have the person in the team who's not doing so well on their own sales because they're really busy coaching and helping everyone else? That is an incredibly valuable thing, but it's just broken all of your value metrics. And I think that provides a really sort of interesting dynamic in itself as well. Yeah,
and I think probably the key word there that probably describes that or at least I feel it does, would be the word performance. But how you measure output, performance as an output varies, because you're right. If you might have a really good team of 10 people, but actually one person holds the whole lot together, but they're a terrible salesperson, but they are a brilliant member of the team. You remove that person because you're measuring performance purely on financial output, the other 9 people suffer. And it is incredibly complex, and there are probably more variables than we could imagine that come into play with that, especially when you even consider that you might have 2 salespeople, but actually one of them will only ever be able to hit a certain performance in terms of sale output, and the other one might be able to do more, not because of their skill set, but purely because of who they know, that the circles that they're in. And that's it's very difficult to do that. And I suppose the most dangerous thing here is when a person, their identity, their value, that intrinsic value, is completely wrapped into their job. And that's a very dangerous place to be, but it's something that we do as a society very, very easily. We slip into that.
Yeah, I'm at this, I'm at that, what do you do? It
exactly.
falls into everyday lexicon.
And my personal experience of that has been very painful because I'm that jack of all trades, master of none. But growing up, until the age of sort of 22, 23, the descriptions of me were flaky, unreliable. In fact, they're the 2 that were the most painful. They're the ones that have stuck with me. But the reality is I was quite changeable in terms of what I wanted to do, how much enjoyment I got out of a job. And for the first 3 months, I was your best employee. But for the next 3 months, I wasn't. And that was my pattern. And for many people, that's really irritating. For most people, that's really irritating. That's not what you want from an employee. I don't want to employ myself because it's not good for me to do that. But as a 23-year-old, I've got no wisdom on that. No one's really there to guide that. No one's there to really say, but actually, this is the way you're built. This is the way you're designed and the way you click. Do this instead. And actually moving into that is fulfilling, enjoyment. I can't get bored every 3 months because no 2-3 months is the same. They change so quickly. And there's the value of me as a 23-year-old, despite having the same characteristics, not the same knowledge, but the same characteristics, was completely different to the value of me as a 24-year-old, purely because I shifted what I was doing. But at that point, in that small gap, there's no real knowledge change. That's the same. My ability to output and perform was the same. The difference was an intrinsic position of what people have described me as in terms of flaky and unreliable isn't true. I just wasn't in the right place to really show what I'm capable of. And I think that it's dangerous. We have to do it as managers, as business owners, as employees. We have to quantify. We can't not do it. But there is an important thing of taking away, okay, this is a value of a person. It's not defined by this one metric that we're using, but this metric is incredibly important for your job.
Yes.
And how you separate that out is quite difficult. And I think you'll know all about it. Culture, making sure people can be heard, listened to, that they can explore that. This is all a part of the power change, which ultimately, in the short term, at least, leads to much better performance of a team.
And I think that's really important to kind of reference here, isn't it? That this power dynamic. I asked you earlier, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And your very diplomatic answer was it depends, and we'll find out later. And this is absolutely true. But we are seeing metrics and studies moving in the same way. I mean, Cotter and Heskett was 1989, and that's sort of pointed in this direction. That's over 30 years ago now. That's also before the rise of Silicon Valley. Or at least in the very, very early days of it. So this is I think it's sort of fairly established to at least some degree that if you do focus on the individual, this naturally changes the power dynamic that we were talking about, but actually also brings back results which are beneficial for the employer. And I think it's very easy to see this as a kind of zero-sum situation where in order for that thing to get better, this thing has to get worse. But actually, is it not more healthy to say, if we empower employees a bit more, actually this has great effects over here as well, and we can all rise and get better. But I'm keen to move on to the next question here, sure. Which is, this power dynamic is shifting. I think we've established that as the sort of the main issue that you can see right now. And probably it's fair to say that it's not actually the power dynamic changing that's the problem, it's our understanding of that and not understanding what that power dynamic is and what it's looking like and what the effects are. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, it's a weird thing. Just because we can't measure something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. It's like I'm a scientist by nature. I want to be able to measure things and quantify them, and I work in tax. I love numbers. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just because we haven't really got a name for something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. So positive psychology, it's always been possible for our brains to be trained to be more positive because we naturally are inclined to think more negatively. It didn't suddenly appear in the 80s when positive psychologists started coining and phrasing things that way. It's always been that way. We just didn't have a name for it. I mean, to make it a really out there point, the colour green has always existed. We might not have seen it because we've never named for it. But once we named it and we saw it and we could differentiate it from blue, green existed. Yes. It was always there.
Yes, no, I think that's a very good point. So looking then at 5 years' time, this is probably slightly sort of different to most of the other episodes we've got here, because it's to say if rather than saying if we fix this problem, it's more about if we let the dust settle and if we let the understanding take place, what's the world that you kind of see at that point? What's the how have we moved forward, and maybe ultimately what have we lost as well? But what could be better?
So I think I've got my pessimist and my optimistic view of that. The pessimistic view is people are very bad at making decisions for themselves. Mm-hmm. Very, very poor at making decisions for themselves. And so this isn't me putting a position on this. This is my pessimistic view. I have the optimistic view too. I hold both simultaneously. I hope for one, I plan for the other.
Yes.
The pessimist in me says that too much personal empowerment leads to too much self-indulgence, mm-hmm. which leads to lower productivity. Yes. So I don't think, and I know this through my own personal life too, if I was left to my own devices from the age of 16 to make all of my own choices with no one holding me to account or putting things in front of me as challenge, I would be a terrible human being. And that's not to suggest that I'm a brilliant human being now, but the man I would have become would have been awful. Truly, truly awful. And I think that empowering people is good, but there has to be challenge, and there has to be a counter to you're wonderful, you're brilliant, you're perfect the way you are, don't ever change. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, this is a problem. and I think that there's a counter to the positivity that has to come in order to be measured. So the pessimist in me is worried that the future looks like so much personal empowerment, so much self-association, self-description, that we lose sight of everything, and most things fall apart because people just don't make good decisions. Mm-hmm. The optimist in me says that we control this in a way that's a little bit more measured. We slow. It's not that we go too slowly, but we put the brakes on to evaluate what's happening and say where is this leading and where is this going to fail. So what are the your first question is what's the biggest problem. Those questions are essential. What's the biggest problem, and we can talk about it from a global scale, from a local economic scale, from one business scale. But that conversation also has to be had with an individual. And I think as long as it scales from the individual doing a role right the way up to the massive global corporate, what's the biggest problem right now? And are you it? that is, I think, one of the ways to measure that without crushing a person and making them feel like if they don't do their job particularly well, they're a terrible human being and have no value. It's a balance. And the optimist in me thinks we are moving towards that balance. And we are still going in the right direction, but we just need to make sure when we get there, we stay there. We don't just blow through the other side of that wall and become exactly the same problem on the other side.
Yes, and I think it's interesting to see sort of market factors in this area. I always sort of joke, but there is really truth behind it that, a decade ago, having a pool table did make you look like an amazing employer. And everything else just kind of went by and was accepted. You can play pool or ping pong or darts or our arcade game or anything you want on your lunch break, and then you'll come back to work and you'll do exactly what you've done for the last 200 years. And that was progressive. And now it's incredible in that short space of time how now people, someone says, oh, we've got a ping pong table. Oh, great. So is everywhere else I've interviewed at. What's actually different about you?
And take it further back. Cadbury's introducing Saturdays as a day off.
Yes.
This is major progression, but once everybody does it, it's no longer special. And the problem with that is again, this is the human bad decisions, bad indulgence. We reach a point where unless everybody only works 1 day a week, you're a bad employer.
Yes.
And actually, but that's like the absolute extreme of it going, that would be so far beyond, we would definitely catch it before we get there.
Yes, of course.
But that's the measuring stick for once one does it, they become exceptional. But once everybody does it, it becomes the norm. Exceptional isn't always good.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's an interesting line in and of itself there. Exceptional isn't always is good. I mean, exceptional's got two kind of words, doesn't it? It's two meanings. One is exceptionally good
yes.
in and of itself. The other is an exception to the rule. And actually...
It's different.
Yeah, the rules that we've created and the kind of societal expectations that we've got, I'm not a big believer that they should be adhered to down to the T. We're free to do whatever we want within the bounds of morality, and so we should be. But actually, allowing those rules to form has meant that they have formed over a long period of tried and tested kind of methodology. That if you then rip up the rule book all in one go and go, screw all the rules, let's crack, you do end up in that kind of situation that you're talking there, certainly if you're not careful about it. And maybe we just have to tear the rules one, tiny bit rather than kind of getting into a frenzy.
Yeah, it's like we almost need an anti-rule. We try to legislate for everything. We try to describe everything, which I think is a very important trait for humanity. We do need to be able to do that. But there just needs to be a measure to say, yeah, but again, it's a very philosophical position, because I am very much on the side of you're not born perfect and you become evil. It's born with flaws and they will come through. It's our job to manage them. It's our job to identify them and try to change them. Mm-hmm. And that is a pure philosophical slant. Somebody else could sit there and believe the absolute opposite of that, and their point is just as valid.
Of course.
So there is a need for that. I'm not prescribing this is definitely the case. A lot of this is built on my basic theology and philosophical positions. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I think that's been really interesting. We have touched more into the kind of philosophy work here, and relationships we touched upon, power dynamics both within employer-employee relationships, but within transactions as a whole, including money. It's been a really interesting kind of meandering debate about ability and empowerment, and I think that's really important that we keep these ideas at the top of our mind, because ultimately the world kind of changes around us, but there's a beauty to the fact that philosophy moves slowly, because there's new ideas, but they build upon old ideas, and we keep pushing forward. But actually, a further and deeper understanding of both the positives and the negatives of human psychology and what it is to be human ultimately has a massive effect on what we've talked about here. And I think that's been really interesting to explore here. So I'm really, really grateful for your time here, David. It's been absolutely fantastic. A little bit of a change from the norm, which has been great. So I'm so grateful to have you on here on What a Future.
Oh, thank you for having me.
My pleasure indeed. Thank you so much.
Thanks.